Today we deal with day 3 of the phase 2 of the appropriating the work or the material of Bernard Lonergan through the use of the concept of fake news. Phase 2 is a directed case study. Phase 1 was just the presentation of the material. Phase 2 is a directed case study. If we go on to phase 3, this is when the participants take over and do their own case study according to the way that they like to do it, following the procedures and so forth, the methodologies that we've been working on and developing for the last few weeks. Day 3 deals specifically with the conditioning aspect of the lower level of the three-part structure. If you remember, we had the transcendental at the top, the core institutional level, and at the bottom we had the conditioning level of the standing wave of matter and energy. Before I go into this, I'd like to mention, first of all, that we're making a shift from common sense intelligence to the realm of theory. If you've ever watched a sunset, there's two ways that you can understand that experience. One is you can watch the sun setting. The earth is stable, the sun is moving, everything is going down. And this is a common sense appreciation of reality. This is the world in which we live. It's how it relates to us. We are obviously not moving. So it has to be the sun that's shifting, the earth is stable. It's common sense knowledge, which is quite valid. For living in the world, we need to have this type of common sense knowledge. But there is another way to understand and experience that same scene. And that is a theoretical one. And that is when you're standing there and you are aware that the earth is rotating and the sun is staying the same. The sun is not moving, but you are moving on the surface of an earth that's spinning at the rate of 1 full revolution a day. And on top of it, if you want to take into the fact that the earth is rotating around the sun over a year cycle, and if you want to take into account that the whole solar system is part of the Milky Way galaxy and itself is moving. So, from a theoretical aspect, we're not simply standing there, we are incredibly moving. We are moving at thousands and thousands of miles an hour, which is valid. Both are. The difference is that the realms of meaning and the methods that is used to determine what is true and the methodology that affirms that something can be true are simply different. There are different rules. As long as you obey those rules, then your results are legitimate. If you follow the rules of the empirical method, the canons of that Lonergan mentions in Insight, then it's quite reasonable to assume that we are moving, the earth is moving, and we have actually experimental evidence of this simply from space flights. Unless you imagine that everything is being videoed as a conspiracy theory someplace in the desert of Arizona, then the ability to send a long-range probe around Saturn and use Saturn as a flyby to go into the outer planets, that's an incredible knowledge that has to be very precise, very exact. So obviously that is real. In terms of our common sense knowledge as existing as human beings, well, that's a question that one has to deal with. But our standards of truth are rather different. The main change that we're talking about here is the difference between objects and things. Now, to a common sense person, the fact that the sun is out there, that the earth is here, that the I am I, we're all objects in that sense. We're something that's identifiable, exterior to ourselves. A chair is a chair, it's over there. That bookcase is a bookcase, it's over there. It's an object and it has a reality external to ourselves. In common sense, this is what we know as bodies. In the realm of theory, bodies don't exist as such. What is important in theory are reoccurring schemes of operations that you can think of kind of as standing waves. The probability of these emerging, and once they emerge to sustain themselves, is a major factor in the worldview of emergent probability. But the important thing is that you can find intelligible patterns in the behavior of the universe, in the behavior of the cosmos, that are regular and they're repeatable, and they're intelligible in the sense that they form a unity of meaning. So if we think of the solar system and the different planets and their orbits and so forth, there's an intelligibility there that is actually very predictable. It's a system that rotates. It does have its variances. The big planets like Jupiter exert an enormous pull on other planets, so much so that places like Io and so forth, Europa, are actually not freezing bodies at all, but because of the internal tensions from the magnetic fields and from the constant tidal effects on the material, they can be actually quite warm to support water, and in one case sulfur geysers. So it's important to keep in mind that what we're doing here, we're not dealing with the common world of objects anymore. We're making a shift into this world of theory. And this is not an easy thing to do. It's like being able to stand on the earth and feel yourself moving and the earth moving and the sun is being stable. This takes a certain twist of mind to be able to, first of all, even understand that that's the case, and then to feel it as an operational part of your world. When we deal with the core, not so much the core level, but the conditioning level, it's very much at the scientific, this theoretical aspect. It is, most of what we do deals with the creation of ways to regulate and maintain various standing waves of matter and energy. And this is quite obvious when there's a very interesting television series that came out about 15 or so years ago called Life After Humans. And it's a beautiful illustration of this point, is that when you remove humans from the scene, the whole process of all our created, the buildings, the operations, the planes, all that just disappears and just gradually degrades and goes back to some form of natural state of being. That program shows or demonstrates in a very graphic way just how important it is that human beings pay attention to the way in which they create this standing wave of energy and material in which they live. Note that at this point we're not dealing with we're dealing with we're not dealing with oughts or what should be. The world is the way that it is. Things relate to each other as they relate to each other. Irregardless of whatever human intentions are, human interests are, and so forth, things just relate to each other in the empirical sciences. And that's, although it's incredibly powerful, has nothing to say about the moral or ethical implications, what is or what should be. That comes at the core level, and particularly comes when we bring in the sublating effects of the transcendental level of intelligibility on the core or institutional levels. Now, once you've starting to make this transition, and this is what, in a sense, we're asking you to do, is to make this transition into the world of theory. The other thing that you need to keep in mind in this whole project is that we're dealing with kind of a top-down approach to structuring things. Most of what we do in institutional life or in academic life, educational life in general, is we start with small disciplines or small areas of knowledge, and then we hope that we can put them together, and through interdisciplinary studies you can get a more complex, a better idea of what's actually going on, and hopefully if you pull enough of them together you'll have a framework in which everything becomes comprehensible. This is probably not the case. There's a transcendental level that's operative or can be operative in human affairs, and this is what Lonergan really taps into. Lonergan provides a philosophical and theological basis for a transcendental level of operations that enable us to understand the very specific orientations of any discipline, academic, or even of different realms of meaning. For example, we've already talked about common sense, and we've talked about the realm of theory. There's also reflective levels, the specialized intelligence involved in scholarship, and the other factors like that, which are all part of this ability, human beings, this drive to know, and the questions that we ask. So we're following a top-down structured kind of approach. This is very useful in one particular sense, is that if you're operating at a lower level of intelligibility, then you're likely to be blindsided by a lot of things that are happening that are simply outside your horizon. There are things that you're not paying attention to. And my favorite example of this is you're in a kitchen and you're cooking, and there's a pan fire on the stove. And it's an immediate, urgent problem. You have to get it out, otherwise your place is going to burn down. So you go to all the effort of getting a fire extinguisher or baking soda or whatever it is that you want to do to put that fire out. The thing is that you're limited in the context. If you take into the context, let's say, of what's happening in the city in which you're living in, and from the city's context, what's happening is there's a massive conflagration that's coming from a forest fire that's about to invade the city. Or there's a dam that's about to burst just uphill that's going to wipe out the city. Now, in that context, putting out the fire on your kitchen stove is probably not what you should be doing at that time. And you're going to be blindsided by this greater fire or by this flood or whatever is happening within your broader range. So we start with the top-down, the broadest conceptual framework that we can develop in a way to reduce the ambiguity, the unexpected, the fog in much of what we do. So unexplained events, unexpected events can not be better predicted, but at least can become part of the way in which you understand the world. You're not isolated, you're not as blindsided, you're not as surprised, perhaps overwhelmed, your whole world could fall apart. This is far likely to take place if you have this broad transcendental level of intelligibility, this higher level of what it means to be human available to you. And this is what we're dealing with. We're trying to establish the fundamental roots of what it is that's important in dealing with understanding fundamental institutional change for the purpose of being able to act as an actor in your own situation according to the greater understanding. So you won't get caught up in the little minutiae that will tend to occupy so many people's days, but also start to pay attention to some broader schemes that will eventually, may very well have a greater impact on your life and the life of those around you than the particular project that you're working on. So this is something that I think our conditions of our time are demanding of us. There's broader awareness, just a broader awareness of what's happening. And what we're doing is using Lonergan's method, or his approach, his transcendental method and his functional specialties, to better get a grasp of the whole, the larger scale of which we are being caught up with, both in our own times. The part of it is that there's a danger in doing this, is that you can become disconnected from the world in some ways. Especially when you have all the disciplines out there that can take a look at the work that we're doing and say, no, this is wrong, or this is inappropriate, or you've forgotten about this, or you're not dealing with this. And from the specialist point of view, they're all perfectly, that's fine. From our point of view too, it's also fine, because listening to these people can help us to modify or change our broader understanding of the events that are taking place at the fundamental institutional change. But also the main consideration though is that, let me put it this way, one of the bigger problems that we have is an institution or a group in an institution is facing a problem. And they will automatically say this is a communications problem, for example, or this is a discipline problem, or we need a sociologist to come in and deal, or a psychiatrist to deal with this particular aspect. It's the level of the evaluation and the diagnostics which we're considering prior to calling in the specialists. So it's that process that normally just gets covered up or happens so fast because To the participants, it's obvious that this is a problem of communication between different institutional departments or government institutions, or perhaps it's a problem of complexity and we got to bring in complexity experts of it. It's so obvious as a problem, but what we're saying is no, it is not obvious. You need to spend some time thinking about and talking about the deeper levels of the orientations of the people, the way in which they come to evaluate the situation, and their diagnosis of the root problems of the symptoms that they're observing. So this is the area that we're dealing with. Now, we've already talked about so far in the stage of identifying 3 different levels of intelligibility. The first one is that standing wave of matter and energy that we call the conditioning level. Without access to this energy and this material, we simply wouldn't exist. So it's a survival issue. It's that basic as that. There's more to being human than simply surviving, as we'll find out when the transcendental realm of meaning becomes part of our investigation. But at this particular level, it's survivability that's absolutely crucial. So whatever you're doing, whatever you're thinking, whatever actions you're taking or not taking, all of them have some sort of impact on this standing wave of matter and energy that forms your civilization. And it's the awareness of this that is something that we're trying to bring forth, that in anything that you do, in the thoughts that you think, in the communications that you do, the arguments that you have, to some degree they're going to impact on the very survival of your civilization. And of yourself too as well, because let's face it, we don't live as individuals, we are part of a civilization. That's very much of a core of us. Now, we had already talked about the core level of the institutions. We had talked about a little bit about the transcendental realm of meaning, but that'll be coming up a bit later. Right now, we're going to spend a little bit of time on the conditioning level. And the first point we come out is the third law of thermodynamics, which I don't know how I think it's if you have a ball and it's not radiating anymore, when it's at absolute zero, then there's no energy available and everything is still quiet. Nothing changes. There are no reoccurring schemes of operations. In a common sense way of thinking, you can think of it as entropy, without getting into the formal definition of what entropy actually means from a physical, scientific point of view. But it's a tendency of things to run down. And again, the TV show on Life After Humans, in which they postulate that in 1 second all humans disappear, and then they document what is likely to happen to our artifacts, to all the things that we leave behind when human beings disappear. And this is a pretty good example of what happens when human beings are removed from the civilization, and then everything just simply degrades. It's always human activities that keep going, that keep things running, that keep things working. And to be aware of that is very, very important. Now the second level, or the conditioning level, it's really a matter of energy, and it's nuclear energy and largely it's solar energy, basically in 2 forms. We have the radiated energy of the sun, and there's also particle emissions and various other things like that come off of it, but largely we're affected by the radiated energy that comes off the sun. And the sun, as we know now, is nuclear powered. As the gravitational pull intensifies, materials elements are brought together in closer proximity, and you start to get nuclear reactions, and this powers the sun. There's another way too as well that solar energy works, and that's through novas. All the higher, denser material elements, like gold, like uranium, carbon, oxygen, all these are generated in supernovas. And then the elements are then distributed across the universe. They become clustered, they collect. So our whole planet is basically consists of, to a large part, of the remnants of these different supernovas. So we have matter, we have energy, and basically we're talking about standing waves pattern. So you can think of the Earth as a whole. It's impacted by this flood of radiation which is extremely powerful. I mean, we're such a small kind of block in the whole sphere of radiation of the sun, and the solar energy is so diffused. But even so, the amount of power there is quite considerable when you take it as an aggregate. And this is enough to, for example, keep water from freezing, and the earth doesn't become an ice ball or a snowball. It's enough to power the emergence of life forms, from very primitive ones to far more complex ones like ourselves, or like the porpoises, or whales and so forth. All of us, from this theoretical point of view, are simply standing waves of recurring schemes of operation that simply continue over time. They modify themselves as situations change. There's evolutionary aspects to it at all. There's quite a bit to it. But essentially, what we're living in is a world that's a structured pattern of matter and energy. From the theoretical level, that's it. Now, what humans do is tap into this energy source. And we did this originally simply by, we're animals. We go out, we do some hunting, we search for vegetables, we drink water, various other things like this. And this is, we accumulate some of the energy that plants concentrated within themselves, or animals concentrated within themselves through their own eating of things lower down in the food chain. Now this is, in human standards, it's a very primitive way of living. It's kind of hunting and gathering. We covered a bit of this in our last session. Once human beings start to settle down in a particular place, they can start to enhance their ability to collect this solar energy by husbandry, by agricultural standard, by raising crops on a regular basis, for example, like in Egypt. This brings about a larger scale of complexity, because now this extra energy allows for the development of higher level of differentiated institutions, let's say religious or kingdoms, or whatever forms they would take. This increased degree of complexity allows for the regulation of the standing wave of matter and energy for that civilization. And as long as that regulation takes place and can occur, that civilization has a good chance of surviving. But if it breaks down, for a variety of reasons, stable societies like that tend to be very vulnerable to disease, to epidemics, to starvation, to a variety of factors that are far beyond their control. But eventually we reach a point that the use of energy becomes so concentrated that you can start to actually create wealth rather than simply redistribute the wealth in terms of matter energy that's there. Now, this created a major split. And is one of the fundamental institutional changes that are currently working themselves out in human history. It largely started with the Industrial Revolution in Britain, in which there was a regulatory system of common law, of private property, of contracts, and an atmosphere in which there was an encouragement to explore and adventure and create new machines, different ways of doing things. It was part of an atmosphere. It was this kind of the spirit of the age. But that spirit of the age was actually incorporated in the institutional structures. So it wasn't simply something emotional that swept over people. It was actually something that was embedded in the institutional structure of that time. Now, when the societies developed the ability to create wealth, rather than simply redistribute it as it used to be done in traditional societies, which simply allowed for like humans on farms would concentrate a certain amount of material. City would appropriate some of this. Kings would, or emperors would appropriate even vast amounts of it. So the amount of energy was never, or material was never really changed. It just became concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. And then there's the traditional structure that supported this, that regulated all these procedures by having standard positions, roles, status, that was believed to be basically inherent in the society and not something that was subject to change. It was just the way things were. Now, the way things were is not quite the same in a society that has learned to be able to create wealth. And this brings about a fundamental challenge to the traditional society's way of working. Because from a traditional society's point of view, the world mediated by meaning is incredibly stable and very constant, so everybody knows, or at least most people within the society or civilization know what the problems are, what the diagnosis, what the root causes of these problems are, and they just cooperate with each other because there's not that much in the way of excess energy that allows them to go out and explore and do different things. The amount of free energy, afloat energy, is relatively low. It's not the same for wealth-creating societies. And this brings us to kind of the final points that I'd like to make in this video, is that there are a number of very fundamental institutional changes that come out of this, the conditioning and the sublating effect of the conditioning level. And one of these is that now governments as a whole are now being held responsible for their ability to manage this basic structure of the standing wave of matter and energy that allows for human, that's what you can call human flourishing or human development. In the past, if you were an emperor or you were a king or you were a top authority figure, the elites could pretty well do what they wanted to do without being hindered very much by kind of the masses of the people under them. Not always true, because there were always peasants' revolts and various other things like this, but on the whole, the elites felt themselves and believed themselves and acted as if they had far more power than in fact they actually did. In our own kind of democratic society, it comes around a little bit opposite. We don't think the elites we don't think that people as individuals have very much power. We tend to think of it as groups having power. And somewhere there's a balance in between the two. But the thing is that we're now getting, there's kind of a general accepted idea that's been developing for a century or so, that governments are being held responsible. And this is compounded by the presence of governments that have failed, or I should say, regulatory institutions that have failed to provide, failed to maintain the basic standing wave patterns that condition their own society. And these we know of as failed states. So Syria, for example, is very much of a failed state, and it's very chaotic there. There's I don't know there's many universities functioning in Syria at the moment. Same with Somalia. Somalia is another failed state. Even getting water now, control of water is becoming a thing that's allocated to warlords more than anything else. Take Venezuela at the moment, which is going through a collapse. Their whole, we think of it as their economy as collapsing, but essentially the conditioning standing wave of matter and energy that sustained their civilization, sustained their culture, has been stripped away. It's been degraded. So the amount of energy, the amount of flow, and the degree of matter that can flow with it is being degraded to such a point that in economic terms, inflation is simply going out of sight these days. The situation is degrading so much so. You also have other, like Libya. The point is that failed states now used to be able to fail in anonymity, didn't bother much But now a failed state can have an impact around the world. Syria, for example, as a failed state, is drawing in Russia, is drawing in China, is drawing in Iran, is drawing in Israel, it's the United States. All sorts of actors now are being drawn into this conflicting, this breakdown of Syria. The same thing, or take Venezuela. Venezuela used to be one of the prime oil producers. But now that production ability is degraded to such a point that they're not, they have less and less of an impact on the world market. And as a result, our oil prices now are starting to increase, simply because of the failure of Venezuela. Not to mention the flows of people that are fleeing desperate situations into surrounding countries. And this is a problem that will become increasingly harsher as time goes by. And this leads to another fundamental kind of change that needs to be considered. Is that when these failed states can no longer deliver a basic standard of human living, then you start to have massive amounts of people on the move, not as refugees from war, but simply people who are looking for a better economic life. Then you've got a problem of what happens when this flood, and it's literally becoming a flood already, and in 15 or 20 years it's going to probably get a lot worse. What happens is when this flood of people enter into a civilization that has a regulatory scheme that's been pretty stable, that can sustain a high level of wealth creation and make it work over a long period of time. So it becomes culturally enculturated, the mentality of a wealth-creating form of civilization. There's an interesting rule in the rule of Benedict, not Benedict Arnold, but the Benedictines' rule of order. And it's very interesting in light of our time. In Benedictine communities are very, very hospitable. If you show up at the door, they will go out of their way to make you comfortable, give you a place to sleep, give you the food, everything. Just the very hospitality is a major feature of Benedictine life. But there is one exception, and it's made very, very clear in the rule. And that is that if you have somebody who enters and is disruptive to the community, then there's kind of procedures to because they're not ousted right away. I mean, this would be inhospitable. But you sit down with them on private one-to-one conversation, then maybe there's 2 or 3 people get together with this person and try to get them to see their ways or whatever they want to do. But eventually, if this persists, then that person or that group is evicted from the monastery. And the fundamental reason for this is that the monastery itself is a good. It's a good of order. It produces an environment in which people can work out their lives in a very meaningful fashion, connected with work, connected with prayer, the transcendental. All these elements are brought together in a way that enables people to live and work together in a very fruitful way. From the Benedictine point of view, that is more important in the end than any particular individual. That needs to be protected, that needs to be encouraged, it always needs to be fostered. This is going to become an ethical question for existing wealthy countries, be they the United States or Europe these days with the immigration problem that they have from failed states now in Africa, to eventually, I would suspect, China as well, and Russia. Soon there's going to be an even greater flow of migrants. And at some point they will overwhelm a developed civilization, simply because the ability of that developed civilization to regulate that standing wave of matter and energy will no longer really be possible, and things will simply break down. It's a bit more complicated than that. History always is. But it is an ethical element that is also going to be a part of fundamental institutional change over the next little while in human history. Because facing the fact of this migratory flows that in some ways resemble locusts, they can come in and they can strip a field. What do you do? How do you deal with it? It's going to be one of the fundamental institutional challenges that are emerging in a particular period of human history. Curiously enough, there's the beginning of an obligation out of this, and you could call it, I suppose, a duty to protect, which is very dangerous to start to think about and to actually start to implement, because it can be very motivating or aggrandizement. But the thing is that if you know a state like Venezuela is going to collapse, and all the problems that are going to stem from it, what do you do? And this is another ethical question that's becoming very much to the fore. Do you allow them to collapse and suffer the migration, the flows, the disruption to what is more and more global sort of market? Or do you go in and take steps to avoid that? So this is another conflict, an ethical conflict that's going to work itself out at the core level of the institutionals, that has their roots in the conditioning level of the standing wave of matter and energy, of that flow, of managing that flow. And it's not an iffy anything about it, it's just a very practical kind of scientific thing to do. The ethical deliberations, however, is not going to be quite as simple. The other institutional change that we've already marked upon to some extent, and that's the difference between wealth-creating societies and traditional societies that simply redistribute wealth. The problem is that institutions or civilizations that have the institutions built for creating wealth create a hell of a lot of wealth over a period of 100 or 200 years. And this puts them at a tremendous advantage over traditional societies that simply rely on agricultural forms of solar energy management and with very traditional structures, social, political structures. So this becomes a major challenge. So one of the fundamental institutional changes that is happening is the bargaining or the interplay of these traditional societies and how they change, but also how the wealth-creating societies too are changing. Perhaps for the better, perhaps not. The evaluative aspect still has to be kind of worked out. But these changes are going on, and they're very, very fundamental changes that operate not only at the local level, but also at the very, very broad level. I'm going to end by reading a simple little paragraph that you will find towards the end of today's notes. And it's basically this. Priorities seem self-evident. If a society cuts off the very ability to modify the Earth's standing wave of energy matter for its own benefit, then it will not only cease to exist, but impact in a negative way on all surrounding societies. This includes any socio-political theory that has an impact on man's capacity to enhance the Earth's standing structural wave of matter and energy flows and transformations. This includes the theories of Karl Marx, the will to power of Friedrich Nietzsche, the existential nihilism of Jean-Paul Sartre, or the postmodernism of Paul Michel Foucault. Each of them, and a lot of others in their own way, alter these recurring schemes of operation that have to do with the economics of complex standing waveforms upon which all civilizations depend. And at some level, it's as simple as that. This is Russell Baker signing off on day 3.